Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the Syria podcast. I'm joined again by Vanessa Bealey, and I'm really pleased to be joined by you today, Vanessa, because the last few days have been really horrendous.
Yes, it's definitely been a bit of a roller coaster when you only have about an hour to pack a bag that has to contain a fraction of your 5 years of life in Syria and leave behind a number of dogs. Out of my collection, I could only take one, so that was not a very easy decision. A few nights ago, we were told that there was potential for a ceasefire. We were told there was going to be a ceasefire and that everyone would lay down their arms within, I think it was 6 hours. So I wouldn't say we relaxed, but we were kind of dialed down a little bit.
Let's start a couple of days before that, because the last time we spoke on this, which was last Tuesday, the insurgents had got as far as Aleppo. And then when you did the UK Column News with me on the Wednesday, you were talking about Hama and Homs as being the next places for them to be. And things didn't move much over the next couple of days. And then all of a sudden, towards Friday, they're going to be in Damascus. And there didn't seem to be any resistance to that. So the question is, what happened? And then on Saturday, Lavrov was at Doha, and there seemed to be a meeting between him and the Iranians and the Turkish, and that seemed to almost be coincident with the fact that any resistance to their moving south towards Damascus seemed to crumble at that point.
Oh, well, I mean, there's a huge number of theories swirling around, everyone trying to mitigate their own circumstances, including, I think, Russia and Iran. I mean, Russia is currently flying the HTS flag over the consulate in Damascus, despite the fact that HTS is a terrorist organization. It's not the elected government, it's the coup government, and definitely hasn't been elected by the Syrian people. I mean, we've talked about this before. I think this was always going to be the Trump effect. We talked about what happened in 2016 when Trump was elected, that really Iran and Russia took their eye off the ball and started thinking that they could make deals. And I think it's been no different this time round. And I think, there are statements coming out from various analysts that Putin basically made a deal with Trump that the eastern sectors of Ukraine would remain under Russian control, etc., etc. And the sacrifice was President Assad and Syria. And we have to remember, after the Aleppo attack, that from the information that I know, Sergei Kissel, who was then the commander of the Russian forces, stood down in the east of Aleppo and left. I mean, I have it on very good authority that one of the Syrian Arab Army brigades was actually abandoned at that point. They continued fighting, and Iranian reinforcements that were coming in basically passed the Russian troops leaving and asked them what was going on, and they said they're heading back to Haimamin. And I think there was utter confusion among the Syrian Arab Army, whether there were orders to stand down, and some defied that order. That seems to be the picture that I'm putting together now. So, all these claims that the Syrian army put down arms and betrayed Assad, I don't think is correct. I think the probability is that there was an order to stand down, and certain factions continued fighting, particularly in Aleppo and particularly in Homs. In Homs, for example, many of the Hezbollah and Iranian factions combined with the Syrian Arab Army continued fighting, because Homs is crucial as a supply line or as part of the supply chain to get weapons to Hezbollah in Lebanon. And then basically that's pretty much what we saw from Hama onwards, is as the terrorist groups approached, the Syrian Arab Army was withdrawing. Once they made it to Damascus, which is about 2 hours from Homs, again, the Syrian Arab Army and the security forces and the police, I mean, they were filmed basically handing over their weapons and being told to take off their uniforms and go home. So what conversation went on between Putin and Assad during Assad's trip to Moscow, although some people now, of course, are saying, well, that was only reported on social media, we didn't see any photos of Assad with Putin, which is relatively strange. I mean, every meeting that they have had, there have been, publicity images disseminated afterwards. But it became apparent, even though, there was just a vacuum of information, to be honest. We were utterly reliant on social media. For me, known sources that I know are reliable and who have good connections within the military, within all sectors of Syrian society. And so therefore I could get some idea of what was going on, but it was delayed. Nothing was real time. Everything was coming in delayed once the advance had happened, and once they were literally on the doorstep. And the first thing that I heard, of course, was the azan, the Islamic prayer in, let's say, a non-Islamist area is very melodic. It's a beautiful sound. And actually where I was, it was particularly beautiful. I used to love just going out on the balcony. The second that they arrived, the azan was played, and it becomes just I call it a dirge, because there's no melody to it. It's really disturbing. And so that was the first thing I heard, which told me, okay, they're here. And then we started to hear the celebratory gunfire. But I mean, it was insane. They were firing into gardens. They were firing, something hit the house at some point. They were letting off fairly big guns, so explosions right next to the house. And then Israel started using bunker buster bombs, because there's no air defense. The Syrian army had stood down. And so they destroyed all the air defense systems, which are very close to where I was living. And the house was shaking for that entire time. That went on pretty much all night. And in the morning, early morning, I mean, nobody got any sleep. Early morning, they were still firing. They were still shouting and celebrating. And it was clear the entire area was full of them.
This was Sunday morning now, and you were in your house with these people outside and in the area, in the community, the area that you were in. Were there any other people?
Yeah, there were, but I literally only found that out yesterday or the day before when a couple of them messaged me, because obviously there's no electricity in Syria, so the whole place is in darkness. So it's very difficult to tell. There's no lights on in the house. You can't tell if anybody's in them. And it was very clear that everyone was kind of hunkering down. Nobody wanted to come out, because you don't know what's facing you. Because, in every area of Syria, there are going to be different sects, different communities. There's going to be members of the military and so on. And so, of course, they're going to be hunting those down in particular. Many of them had left their houses there and either gone to the coast or left Syria and left their workers behind, for example. So it was the workers that were dealing with this situation and, in a sense, defending the property. Because, of course, then what started happening around 8 o'clock, I was told that they were starting to loot all of the empty houses there. And at around 10 a.m., I was on the phone, actually, to Marwa Osman, who people will obviously know, Lebanese journalist, and a very good friend. And I was on the phone to her, so she could hear all of the gunfire. And suddenly it was like someone had actually hit the front gate with a battering ram. It was extraordinary. I mean, I did jump because I thought I saw literally a grenade or something had been thrown at the door. And Marwa was basically telling me, well, have you got any weapons in the house? I said, Marwa, what am I going to do? If they've got Kalashnikovs, what on earth am I going to do? So I thought, well, the only thing I can do, I just yelled at them in Arabic to kind of let them know I'm here. There's someone here. The house is not empty. And thank heavens, the dogs were going nuts at this point, because I'm shouting and they're hammering on the door. So this went on I guess, for about 5 minutes, and them shouting, and I couldn't honestly understand what they were saying. They were just yelling. They went. So I guess maybe the dogs put them off way more than my shouting, I would have thought. And these were just petty thugs, thieves, that were taking advantage of the situation, the chaos, to come into the area and start stealing and looting and destroying, which is, what's quite incredible to me, Mike, is how I was kind of looking through mainstream media just before we started talking, and for the hours before we started talking, and it's extraordinary. These terrorist factions have just been converted back into rebels again by the BBC and CNN and Sky News.
Well, it's worse than that, isn't it? Because they're being converted into the next government.
Yeah, and they're not elected. I mean, this is, they've just taken power, basically. There's no election. And of course, what we're seeing now, that again is not really being reported at all in mainstream media, is the beginning again of mass executions. There was an execution tonight in the center of Damascus. They're putting up gallows in Homs and Hama. Gallows.
But this can't be right, because on the way home from the office today, the BBC told me that Damascus is operating as normal. Everybody's happy. They're all joyous. At least Doucette assured me that there was still a little bit of enthusiastic gunfire to celebrate what was going on, but everything was back to normal.
Yeah, well, of course she did. And we know that at least Doucette from day one of the regime change war against Syria was on the ground lying. I mean, fundamentally, just making stuff up. When the terrorists were firing mortars into the center of Damascus, I mean, Eva Bartlett, who was there at the time in 2014, wrote about this. They were targeting the center of Damascus, targeting civilian and residential areas and schools with mortars. And Lise Doucette saw it, went to the hospital, interviewed children that had been hit by the mortars while they were in their school, and then went back to the BBC and reported that it was probably the Syrian Arab Army attacking their own people. So, this is the absolute malfeasance of Western media. And then, of course, they're all over Damascus now. What does that tell you? We didn't see them for the last 4 years, since all areas of Syria that were under terrorist occupation were liberated. We didn't see them. But now the terrorists are back in power. They're all over the place. And they're getting a free pass to come in and bolster the image of these mass executioners that are now carrying out sectarian killings across the country.
Look, let's come back to what happened on Sunday then. So they tried to break in. You've managed to chase them away because you believe because of the dogs. What happened then?
Then basically I was told that the border isn't open. I mean, I had actually kind of packed as much as I could the night before. I couldn't take very much. I could only take really essentials. So everything was kind of ready, and I was speaking to the driver, who was telling me, look, there's literally nobody at the border. There's no soldiers and there's no police. There's nobody to stamp your passport. It's impossible to go. I then spoke to a Lebanese driver who was at the Lebanese side of the borders, and he said, no, look, you can come through. You've just got to push your way through the armed groups that are there. You're just going to have to go for it, because the problem is this was in the midst of all the chaos of the so-called victory, right? So they were all drunk on the victory, drunk on the ability now that they had to loot absolutely everything. So to a degree, they were not paying attention. So at that point, my driver liaised with the Lebanese driver to meet at a point between the Syrian border and the Lebanese border, and for me to get out of one car and throw all my stuff, including the poor dog, into the other car and continue to the Lebanese border. So we decided to go for it. And as I was leaving kind of the suburb that I'm living in, literally they were crawling over the houses. They'd broken in many of them. They were taking everything from TVs to dining room tables to everything. They were gutting whole neighborhoods. There were gunmen everywhere. The checkpoint that was formerly Syrian Arab Army was overrun with gunmen. We got through that, and then we went on the. I'm only about 10-15 minutes from the Syrian border, so it's not far. But there were gunmen all on the road as we were traveling. Again, still firing in the air. When we arrived at the border, it was kind of like a Mad Max scene. It was insane. There were just trucks and pickups and motorbikes and every kind of vehicle there, with guys in black with carrying guns crawling over the shops. And the funniest thing is they're supposed to be these strict Islamists. And they were stealing all the booze out of the kind of duty-free shop that's on the Syrian border side. But yeah, when you arrive at the Syrian border, but everything was getting looted. And so again, we sort of had that in our favor, because although they were looking at us, and although they were looking at me, and I have to say I'm kind of regretful I didn't film anything, but I just thought I'm not even going to try, because I don't want to draw attention to myself at this moment. Basically, my driver, God bless him, pretty much rammed his way through, because it was chaos. They were all fighting amongst each other for the greater spoils, and my driver had to do a number of kind of maneuvers to cross from one side to the other to avoid all the trucks and the guns and everything else. And they were looking at us, and they were definitely looking at me, but nobody stopped us. My passport wasn't stamped. There was nobody to look at my passport, nobody to look at any paperwork at all, and we got through. And that's when, the Lebanese car was waiting at the designated place.
Just before you continue this, I just want to just sort of pay a little bit of respect to your driver, because he really did put his life at risk to help.
Yeah, he did. He did. And, I've known him for a long time. But, yeah, it was, he was incredibly brave to do that. There's not many people would have done it. Most drivers would have turned back when they saw that kind of insanity going on in front of them. And, as I said, these are kind of really the dregs of society. They're people who would be criminals in any society, who were profiting or profiteering from what was happening. And that's what's going on pretty much throughout Syria. I've spoken to Nabal al-Abdullah, the commander of the National Defense Forces in Skalbir. They destroyed the church. They destroyed all of the buildings around the church, the statues, and so on. This is, and they were doing this in Aleppo. Houses were getting looted. I know in my area now, I was speaking to my neighbor yesterday. They formed a committee, and at night I know they're patrolling with weapons. But and of course, again, I rent the house, so I felt a huge degree of responsibility to leave it, because there was nobody there taking care of it. I managed in the end to arrange with my neighbor to keep an eye on it and so on. But it's a horrible feeling, because you're just leaving everything behind, from my car to everything that I owned, knowing that at any moment it could just be absolutely stripped bare. I can't go back to get any of those things anyway, but I would far rather that they go to decent people who've been friends of mine for years than go to these creatures.
And your driver got home safe?
Yeah, but it did take, I think, crazy amount of time. I think around 4 hours for him to get back. So I'm not yet sure what happened. But he's been back to Lebanon since then. So I'm assuming it's sort of either calmed down or, he just gets on with it.
Yes. Yeah, so you were met at Lebanon at the border crossing. You got through the border crossing, and you found accommodation.
Yeah, I have to say the Lebanese border crossing was also chaotic. It was packed full of people trying to get out. But at the same time, what people are now facing. I don't know what Lise Doucet is looking at, But the passport and immigration building, which is a huge building in the middle of Damascus, was burned to the ground yesterday. They've released all the prisoners from Kafr Sousse prison, which is again in the center of Damascus.
Is this Sadnaya? Is that the same place?
No, Sadnaya is on the outskirts of, well, it's kind of northwest of Damascus. It's in the countryside. It's near the town of Sadnaya. And of course, the ironic thing, the majority of the prisoners in Sadnaya were the terrorists that attacked Sadnaya, which is a Christian town very close to the prison. You know, and of course there's no verification on the prisoners that are being released. Like, nobody knows who they are. They've just been allowed out into society. A huge number of them would have been members of the terrorist factions.
So let's talk about these terrorist factions. I found something that you said there a minute ago really disturbing, that Russia is flying the HTS flag on the consulate. And you know, I was willing to give Russia a bit of the benefit of the doubt here because Lavrov said at the weekend that it would be unacceptable for HTS to be given free rein in Syria because they're extremists and terrorists. And as I mentioned previously, the whole special military operation in Ukraine was based on the premise that Russia was dealing with extremists and neo-Nazis and so on. So if they're flying HTS flag, then that, at the very least, is hypocrisy.
Well, you also can't forget that Ukraine intelligence has been in Idlib recruiting HTS to go and fight against Russia in Ukraine. So yeah, it's kind of the ultimate hypocrisy. And there have been statements along the lines of, you know, pretty much opaquely supporting HTS from, I would say, Iran and Russia. And, you know, the blame game is now going on, of course, and social media is absolutely rife with it. I understand, I really do understand the Syrian population changing their Facebook profiles to the Free Syrian Army flag. I understand it completely because they're terrified. They're absolutely terrified. I mean, the last that I've heard is HTS are dividing Damascus up into sectors, and then all of those sectors are going to be house searched. And what does that mean? They're going to go through their Facebooks, their phones, their everything to see if they were supporters of the government, or even not necessarily supporters of the government. They could also just be against the terrorist factions. So, you know, the mass executions that are now ongoing, anybody that had any connection to President Assad, and if they in some ways were crazy enough to remain or couldn't get out, are now being hunted down. And this is how you heal Syria. I mean, it's just extraordinary, you know, the videos that are now coming in of these sectarian executions. I mean, it's almost as if Jolani, his entire history is forgotten. He was incubated in Camp Bukra in Iraq. He was the kind of second in command of Baghdadi. He was originally with ISIS. He then formed Al-Qaeda in Syria, Nusra Front. He then rebranded through various different monikers and then ended up as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and was presented by media outlets like PBS and CNN as the legitimate opposition to the Syrian government, completely airbrushing his previous terrorist activities and criminal acts.
That's a key point, because you said there his history was forgotten. It hasn't been forgotten. It's been intentionally whitewashed. Isn't even the right word. It's laundered in the sense of money laundering. It's you know, they've taken his reputation.
No, it's wiped. It's just been wiped clean. You know. And it's like I was just reading a BBC article kind of talking about who's in control of Syria, and I noticed they don't really mention Israel until the end. But you know, they don't once talk about who Jolani was. It's the rebel group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. The rebels did this. The rebels are rebels. We're back to this utterly reprehensible terminology that Western media is using to absolutely, again, I don't even know what the word is, it's to iconize terrorists. I mean, just as they've done with the Nazis in Ukraine, and just as they've done, just as they've ignored the Zionist crimes largely against Palestinians. This is the problem. And I watched David Lammy's speech today, banging on all the same old stories about President Assad, and so pleased with himself that he's gone.
I mean, this was a very similar reaction to once Gaddafi was gone, and we saw what happened to Libya once he was gone. Is this what you're expecting in Syria?
Much worse. It's much, much worse, because in the last 48 hours, Israel has bombed more than 320 times. And it's completely decimated Syria's weapons development, its military infrastructure, its navy, its air defense, all of its military bases, its air bases. It hasn't yet bombed the actual civilian airports, but it has destroyed. I mean, Syria is now, what is it? I mean, any nation that doesn't have a military, that doesn't have any kind of defense capability, what does it become? It just becomes a playing field for the predators. And who are the predators in this case? The US, Turkey, Israel, and the terrorist factions that are backed by both Israel and Turkey and the US, and Russia trying to do a deal so it maintains its naval base. I mean, it's just become this sort of, and when we talk about the fact that supposedly the proxies of Turkey and Israel have taken over Syria, so why is there a need to dismember Syria now? Because you have the power in place that you wanted, that is supposedly going to collaborate with you, going to be allied with you, that's going to provide you with whatever you need from the country, right? And yet Israel is destroying it. And of course, the excuse from Israel is, well, we don't want those weapons to fall into the rebels' hands, in quote marks, while they've been
as if they're the enemy.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's insane. And right now, Israel is it's advanced to a point where it's about 15 minutes from my house, which is 20 minutes from the center of Damascus.
In that article in the BBC that you were talking about, they have a section who controls what territory in Syria, and they've got the map of Syria there, and they have this big red area that runs down from Aleppo to Hama to Homs to Damascus, which is Syrian opposition led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham terrorists, but that's opposition, right? And then they have north of that, they have yellow areas, which are Turkish-backed Syrian rebels and Turkish military. And then they have a big, what's about a third of the country to the northeast, which is Kurdish-led forces. And then they have marked on this new sort of battlefront, which is taking place at the moment between the Kurdish-led forces and these Turkish-backed forces. And then they have, say, 50% of the rest of Syria, which is hatched, which they're describing as previously held by the Syrian government. And then you have Al Tanf, which is the US military base in purple, and around the Al Tanf base is this orange area, and then below to the southwest is another orange area around Deraa and Sweda, which they have labelled as unidentified opposition groups. And I thought to myself, yeah, my backside. We know who these unidentified opposition groups are. They're ISIS, right? And aren't they? Because that's who the US deploys. So around the US base.
Well, no, hang on. Around those areas now, it's Israel. So it's even more disingenuous.
Right.
Because when I looked at that map,
is it actually Israeli personnel on the ground?
Yeah.
Right, yeah. But I knew they'd come in from the Golan Heights to some degree, but I didn't realize they'd gone right round Deraa and Sweda.
To Damascus. They've advanced to, this morning they were at Qatar, which is kind of to the west of where I was. Now they are advancing to Dimas, which is like a kind of a mountain town, which is literally 10 minutes away from me driving. So they've come into to the absolute western suburbs of Damascus now, which puts them 15 kilometers from the center of Damascus.
So that's hilarious then, because unidentified opposition groups. Well, on Monday's UK Column News, I was pointing out that in the report from the BBC journalist that was there, she was saying there are explosions going on at military air bases, but we don't know the cause. But they just couldn't bring themselves to say it's Israel that's doing it.
And this is what people kind of maybe don't understand is, until now, actually it demonstrates what a good job the Syrian air defense were doing, right? Because until now, Israel couldn't use their bunker buster bombs because they couldn't get close enough. So they were simply using, ballistic missiles, which were being brought down by the air defense. A very small percentage were hitting target. Now there's no army, so there's no air defense. So what is Israel doing now? It's just violating airspace. It's just coming into a free zone, and it's bombing with hundreds of bunker buster bombs. And I mean, a friend of mine in Damascus said, now we know how Gaza and Lebanon feel, because it was unbelievable. Our house was shaking all night. And it was the same experience for me when they bombed close to me the night the terrorists entered my area. The whole house, I mean, I was like, where are they hitting? It felt like they were literally hitting the villa next door to me. All my windows, the whole house was shaking. And the air defense bases that they were hitting at that point were probably, I think they're in the region of 5-6 kilometers from me. So imagine this, they're hitting air bases, they're hitting ammunition stores, they're hitting science development centers and so on, in and around Damascus. So the whole of Damascus was reverberating with this bombing. And if the BBC is basically saying, well, we don't know what's happening, of course they knew what was happening. This is impossible for them, because you heard the jets. Here in Lebanon, we could hear them. We could hear the jets and we could hear the explosions, because the family I was with were afraid, because they thought the bombing of southern Beirut was starting again. That's how loud it was.
Let's just come back onto this unidentified opposition groups again. So around on the southwest, Deir al-Suwaida, right up to Damascus, that's Israel. Is it also Israel around Al-Tanf?
No, around Al-Tanf is ISIS. ISIS and sort of offshoots of the Free Syrian Army type factions. But ISIS has been re-released, of course, into the central area. So if you look at Al-Tanf and you go to the north, and you've got the big central area of desert below, between Deir ez-Zor and Al-Tanf, and ISIS have been carrying out executions of Syrian army there. I think yesterday 54 soldiers were executed.
But again, this can't be right, because Joe Biden told me the other day that the United States was bombing ISIS.
No, I think he meant giving bombs to ISIS.
Ah, right. Okay, sorry. Maybe I misheard.
I think,
it could be that he wasn't quite on his usual form. I don't know, but
yeah, he got his script mixed up, I think.
I mean, we shouldn't be laughing about this, but at some point it becomes so ridiculous that what else can you do? Because the narrative that people are being told is just such a pile of nonsense. You know, it's really hard not to just laugh at it.
And by the way, there were clashes tonight between the Lebanese forces, not Hezbollah, but the army, and HTS on I think it's the northern border. I'd have to check, because they've mentioned one village. I need to check where it was.
Well, that was going to be another question I was going to ask. Does HTS stop at the Lebanese border, or are they going to continue?
No, I think they'll continue, because you've got in Tripoli, which is to the north of Lebanon, right by the border that I entered through, when the main border was bombed by Israel. there in Tripoli, there's a huge number of extremists that escaped Syria during the war and ended up in Lebanon. So potentially there's high risk of those factions there joining forces with HTS in Syria that now have control of the Lebanese border, and Israel coming from the south and potentially taking control of the main border, because they're not far from that now.
And okay, we've already talked about Russia flying the HTS flag, but what is the situation going to be with the Russian bases on the seafront?
Well, I think that's part of the deal. I think they've asked to be allowed to keep their base in Hamamim and their navy. And as far as I know, Israel didn't destroy any part of Hamamim. It destroyed oil tankers. They've destroyed the entire Syrian naval fleet. I mean, it wasn't massive anyway, but there's just floating vessels now, burned out, hollowed out vessels just floating in the water in Latakia, which is of course a little bit to the north up the coast from Hamamim. So, and also this is another thing for people to understand now, that if you like, the target for the terrorist executions are, of course, the Shia Muslim and the Alawite Muslim. I mean, they're not being picky. They are executing just about any Syrian army soldier that they come across, even in hospitals.
Right. That in itself is a war crime.
Yeah, of course it is.
But in the meantime, the BBC is playing these guys up as being the saviors of the world. So we are accepting war crimes now.
Yeah, and I mean, I replied to Lamy on X. I just said, you're degenerate. And I posted like at least 4 of the executions. And I said, you're banging on about Assad's crimes, including chemical weapons, which has been completely discredited. But, the kind of, the machine just keeps going with the narratives. And it's almost like it is gaslighting, because people are just browbeaten by it, because it just doesn't go away. Whatever the evidence to disprove their narratives, the narrative just keeps coming back. It keeps coming back. It keeps coming back. And it's almost like, I give up. It's just like this, what's the point? No one's actually, of course there's a point to continuously pushing back, but it is horrifying. And what is horrifying for me is how fast this was in 10 days. If you had told me 10 days ago that this was going to happen, I'd have just laughed it off. Nobody saw it coming. Everyone saw, at least most of the people that I knew were well informed that there was an attack imminent from Idlib. And so that begs the question for me, at what point did Russia decide, let's do a deal, let's sacrifice Assad because that's who everyone wants gone? Turkey, Israel, HTS, America, France, UK, everyone wants him gone, right?
Let's just investigate that a little bit. How often, up until this most recent one, how often were there attacks from Idlib?
Quite regularly, particularly because they had drone technology that was massively improved by the Ukrainian element, by Turkey, and I think also by NATO member states that had specialists in Idlib training and so on. But Ukraine had probably the biggest influence in certainly this last year.
Okay, but when you say that they were expecting, or people were expecting something, were they expecting something different to the types of attacks that you're talking about that had already happened?
According to what I was told, yes, they were expecting a major offensive, and they were preparing for it.
Is it beyond the realms of possibility that, in fact, the deal had already been done before word of that major offensive had got out? That the reason that the major offensive was happening in the first place was because a deal had already been done?
Yeah, I mean, that's a possibility that I'm not going to rule out. I think, because the thing is, I think everyone right now is defending their integrity. Let's put it that way, from even members of Assad's government. And as I said, I don't blame the people in Syria for ostensibly switching sides. I don't blame them, because they don't have a choice. But when there's even members of government doing it publicly, and you know, my question is, well, okay, if you had all these issues, why didn't you bring them up? You were in a position to do something about them for the last 14 years and you didn't do anything. So I think everyone now is trying to kind of limit the damage to their own reputation. And, you know, I was speaking to people from Venezuela, and what a lot of Latin American countries feel now that are non-aligned, they're feeling very much, well, if Russia's going to throw Syria under the bus, what are they going to do if we face US military intervention? Are they going to drop us like a hot potato if the US does a deal with them, or Trump does a deal with them as well? And so now they're kind of saying, well, what's the point? We might as well align with the US because it's no different.
So what we've seen over the last couple of years is this massive alignment of many, many countries with Russia and China and the BRICS, the so-called global south and so on. And it has been forming what the West might consider to be a real threat. Is there a possibility that whole thing could unravel at this point because of this decision by Russia to withdraw?
I think so, yes. Because unless there's very hard evidence that Russia has another reason for doing it, it just looks very suspiciously like they saw an opportunity to improve their situation in Ukraine at the expense of Syria.
And a lot of these so-called non-aligned countries were relying on the protection that Russia and China were going to give them.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think you'd have to be a little bit delusional to think that China's going to come to the rescue of anyone. China's going to come to the rescue of China, that's it. You know, I think people do talk about China's soft power capacity and so on. And yes, to a degree, it's always to China's advantage. I don't think China's going to invest in soft power in a country that isn't going to give it advantages. And I think, you know, we have to be pragmatic about this. And I think the problem is, and I'll include myself in this, you know, I did see Russia as a people, as a bastion of traditional values and you know, whether you want to call it conservative, whatever, it doesn't matter. But they represented something that the West was cutting itself loose from, which was community, faith.
Family.
Family, everything. But then again, you know, when I speak to Westerners that are living in Russia, as they say, you know, it's not a revolutionary country. It's a very kind of, it is a capitalist country. And there are many people in the country that don't believe in those traditional values either. And this is the thing, you know, I think it's very difficult to kind of lump everything together. And I know there'll be many people saying, see, I told you so, like Russia's just as bad as everyone else. But I think it's way more complex than that. I think in every country there's going to be people, there's going to be ruling factions that are against what certain other factions of the ruling elite are trying to push through, etc. There's always going to be conflict over agendas. But I think what has now happened in relation to BRICS, into relation to this whole kind of multipolar world vision, is that people, yes, the smaller countries are going to feel very vulnerable and very nervous about it. And as someone well connected to the Venezuela government said to me, well, we might as well pivot to the US, because what difference does it make? One will betray us, the other one is going to, you know, potentially interfere in our internal affairs, but we're on our own. And even speaking to people here, I mean, now Syria, of course, is going to be dismembered and balkanized and partitioned, and basically it'll be embroiled in a kind of Libya-type gang-on-gang fighting forever. Because after they've exterminated all the various communities they don't like, they're going to start fighting each other.
And we should remember, of course, that a lot of these people are not even Syrian.
No. Oh, yeah, no. I mean, there's a video in Latakia of a Uyghur terrorist talking about how great it is to be there, and I'm just laughing. This is supposed to be the Syrian grassroots rebellion. Okay, all right. What? Backed by Turkey, Israel, the United States, the Gulf states, France, Germany, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. I mean, okay, all right. And then packed full of Chechens. I mean, yesterday the Turkestan Islamist Party drove into Damascus center. And I have to say they look remarkably like Ukrainian special forces from the uniform and so on. And Turkey now is rolling into Aleppo. Tanks are coming into Aleppo. I mean, you know, I hate to say it, and it absolutely breaks my heart, but Syria's gone. It's gone. It's not going to come back. How can a country recover from this? It has nothing now. It has a terrified population, mass executions going on. It has no defense, no army, no resources, and no leadership. Because the leadership are who? ISIS, Jolani, Al-Qaeda, however he's rebranded himself, but it's still the same guy, and he's not going to, you don't give up on these kind of extremist ideologies overnight. And all the reassurances that he's giving, that nobody's going to be bothered. I mean, there's already videos coming out of women in Damascus getting stopped at checkpoints and being told to put on the hijab and so on. So I look forward to Lise Boufat putting on her hijab.
Yeah, right. So we'll end up with Israel owning the south, Turkey owning the north, the United States owning the area around Al Tanf, and it's just a free for all in the rest of the country.
And the worst thing is, I mean, the Alawite, the coast is traditionally Alawite Shia, although it's still mixed. But the fact that they're even in those areas, and those areas were promised to be kept safe, and many of the people that fled Damascus went to the coastal areas for safety, and of course now they're not safe because those areas have been invaded by the sectarian mass murderers. I can have some sympathy. There were a lot of issues in Syria, many of which were exacerbated, of course, by sanctions, by occupation of resources and so on. But there was a lot of mismanagement. But is this any better? Of course it isn't. It never is. How many people now wish they had Gaddafi back, or wish they had Saddam Hussein back, or Mubarak in Egypt? This is the point.
We've mentioned many times the fact that Britain was working to foment opposition in Syria from at least 2004, perhaps earlier. So this has been a 20-year project at the very least.
Well, and you can go back a lot further, because you can go back to the clean break doctrine that was penned by CIA for Netanyahu back in 97, the new Middle East. And of course, Netanyahu's been talking about reshaping the Middle East for more than a year now. And this is basically what's happening. I mean, Israel's on cloud nine.
But if you have that type of external influence operation, which is working towards, on a long-term basis, a regime change, is it then surprising if the regime is hard on its opposition when it knows that opposition is being influenced, controlled, but certainly directed and encouraged by an external, a foreign enemy?
Yeah, and I mean, if you go back historically since 1946, how many coup d'etat, regime change, clandestine operations led by Israel, CIA, MI6 have been waged against Syria? And the tool that they use is the Muslim Brotherhood. So I would also argue with it being the opposition. It isn't the opposition. It's a British-created and incubated organisation that is supposed to be the political arm of Islam, but that's just cover for terrorism, and that's what it's always been in Syria. And it's been, absolutely weaponized against previous governments in exactly the same way. And now it's won. And the thing is that what has Erdogan been doing for years, even before 2011, is basically nurturing the Muslim Brotherhood in Turkey to expand his neo-Ottoman empire into Syria, into northern Syria. And I mean, honestly, the next thing you're going to see is Erdogan praying in the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, as he said back in 2012.
Okay, well, let's leave it there for today. We have a lot to cover in the coming discussions, because I think it's worth reviewing the last 20 years in particular, but maybe you may feel we need to go even further back. But I think it's worth reviewing the last 20 years, because Syria is only one example, as we've mentioned, of these type of regime change operations. If we can understand what has happened here, then maybe we can understand some of the other operations that are still ongoing.
I do think that that is what is rather sad, because if you go back, just one last point, but if you go back to 1946, the regime changes back then and the coup d'etat that were fostered by the Western intelligence agencies were to break the alliance between the Soviet Union and Syria, and then later between Russia and Syria, right? So actually Syria has, if you like, maintained its alliance with Russia against all odds. And that has been literally thrown into the bin, apparently, by Russia right now.
Well, we'll leave it there for today. Thank you very much, Vanessa, for joining me, and we'll see you next week.